Get ready, because today we're going to talk about writing characters who descend into madness. We're particularly going to focus on the 1980 movie The Shining, so if you haven't seen that yet, consider this your spoiler warning. By the way, my name is Brandon McNulty. I'm the author of Bad Parts, also the author of Entry Wounds, and welcome to my writing channel. One of my subscribers requested a video on characters who descend into madness, and I thought that was a great idea for a topic because I typically love these types of stories, whether it's The Shining or the video game Silent Hill 2, or the Joker movie from a few years ago, or the short story The Yellow Wallpaper. A lot of my favorite stories involve characters who descend into madness. And today what I want to focus on in this video, I want to talk about the key ingredients you need at the start of a story like this, where you can set things up, and then I also want to talk about how you structure out a descent into madness. But before we go anywhere, let's first of all just define what madness is for the purpose of this video. And I just looked up a few basic definitions. Madness is the state of being mentally ill, especially severely. It's the condition of being insane, a derangement of the mind, or it could also be a frenzied or chaotic state. So any of those definitions work for this particular video. The key thing to remember here is that there is going to be an element of mental illness here, and if you are writing these types of stories, do your research so you can make the most authentic portrayal possible. Your audience will definitely appreciate it. Also, at the very beginning of the video, I mentioned that I'll be talking about The Shining today, and I'll be giving a lot of examples from this movie. If you haven't seen it in a while, it's a story about a writer named Jack Torrance who moves his family to this remote hotel in order to be its caretaker over the winter. And during his time at the hotel, he descends into madness. So we'll be talking about that a lot today, and I have some video clips that go along with it. But if you plan on telling a story about madness, you have to remember that there are some key ingredients that you may want to include. The first of these is an unreliable narrator. And this is a character, usually your protagonist, who the audience doesn't know whether or not to believe what they're telling us or showing us. So, for instance, if you have a written story, meaning like a novel or a short story, you might have that story told in first person from a narrator, and we don't know if we should trust that narrator. Do we believe what's written on the page, or do we just imagine that it's made up in their head? And the same applies to screen-based stories, whether it's a movie, a TV show, a video game, whatever it is. What we see on the screen, we don't know. Is it true reality, or is it just inside the character's head? Or maybe it's somewhere straddling line between the two of them. But the important thing here is that there's ambiguity. It could be supernatural, it could be in the character's head, it could be reality, we don't know. Another key ingredient is anxiety. You want your audience to be anxious, you want them to be in suspense about all the terrible things that can happen because of this potentially mad character. For instance, you may have a character who performs some odd behaviors or has some random outbursts early on that could potentially explode later on in the story. And then the final two key ingredients are the tragic flaw and the tragic backstory. With flaws, we're talking about something that a character gives into again and again over the course of the story. It can lead to their undoing. In the case of Jack Torrance in The Shining, his tragic flaw is his anger issues and his alcohol issues. And then when we're talking about tragic backstory, this is often related to things like guilt or trauma, something in the past that continues to haunt the character. The next thing I want to talk about is the starting point for your madness story. And this includes three things. And it starts with a sane, sound-minded protagonist who enters into a new situation in which great pressure is applied to them. Now, in the case of The Shining, we meet Jack Torrance early on. He's a pretty regular guy, aside from the fact that he's played by Jack Nicholson. We see him, he's a father, he's a husband, he's a writer, and he's looking for a new job. So nothing really setting off the alarms here early on, and he's just entering into this new situation where he gets this gig as a hotel caretaker during the winter months. That's a new situation for him, and it puts a lot of pressure on him for two reasons. And when you are applying pressure to your characters, make sure that there's more than one source of pressure. In the case of The Shining, the first source of pressure is the isolation. He's alone in this hotel with just himself and his family. There's nobody else he has contact with. And then there's another source of pressure, and it's a brutal one.
Well, I suppose I ought to try to do some writing first.
Yeah, that'll do it. Okay, now let's move on, and we'll take a look at how to structure a descent into madness. And in the first part of your story, Act 1, the first 25%, whatever you want to call it, you want to be hinting at the potential for madness. You do this by looking at both the character and the situation. So in the case of The Shining, we look at the character Jack Torrance, and we learn early on that there was this past incident in which Jack dislocated his son's shoulder during a drunken rage, and that hints at something horrible that can happen down the line. Then when we look at the situation, we learn during Jack's interview with his employer, we learn that a former caretaker once murdered his family within the hotel. There's also a mention of the Donner Party when the family's driving up, and of course there's constant references to the fact that the hotel has been built upon an Indian burial ground. So early on, you want to hint that the character in the situation can lead to madness. Then as you move into Act 2, as you move into the middle of the story, things will be swinging back and forth between reality and madness. And in the case of The Shining, we see Jack having different hallucinations, and then he comes back to reality. For instance, when he's in the gold room, he has a drink with a ghost. And then his wife comes into the gold room, and the ghost is gone, and Jack is telling his wife that she's crazy for thinking that there's a woman in the hotel who's abusing their kid. And then Jack ends up making out with that very woman. And then Jack ends up denying that there was any woman in that room in the first place. And then Jack ends up having a conversation with the hotel's former caretaker, that guy who killed his family. So there's that back and forth, back and forth. And then it ends in this type of story with what I call the divorce from reality. And this is a moment in a madness story in which the protagonist makes a permanent shift toward madness. And this moment may be big or small, but it's a moment where the character abandons their conventional everyday self in favor of their dark desires, needs, and truths. Now in The Shining, this moment is actually a small one, and it's the moment in which Jack destroys the two-way radio. And this, of course, is the only connection that the family has between the hotel and the outside world. So if they want to contact someone, they do it by the two-way radio. Once Jack destroys the thing, then his family is just isolated in that hotel with him, and there is no one else out there who they can call for help. And then after the divorce from reality, you have the final act of this particular story, the final 25%, and this is where the character becomes completely unhinged, they embrace their madness, and they endanger themselves as well as others while pursuing those dark desires, needs, and truths. So I hope this helps. Question of the day: what is your favorite story about a character's descent into madness? Let us know in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to keep me sane, please pick up a copy of either one of my novels. Also be sure to check out my other videos. Hit the like and subscribe buttons for me. Share this video with a friend. And as always, remember to keep on writing.